All right, so natural selection. This is something that everyone's heard about. For the most part, you heard this being referred to maybe as survival of the fittest or something having to do with evolution. So when we're talking about this, we are referencing it to evolution, and it's an idea that was first presented by a scientist working in the Galapagos Islands. His name is Charles Darwin. So, the big thing here, natural selection, is the main mechanism of evolution. So, when we talk about evolution, which is change over time, which is like new species occurring and this evolving from that, natural selection is the way that happens. So natural selection is the mechanism, meaning it is what actually does the evolution, is what drives the evolution. So without natural selection, without that survival of the fittest kind of pruning property, then evolution would not occur. Okay, so what it actually means is survival and reproduction of the fittest. So when you are talking about natural selection and things surviving and causing things to evolve, just surviving is not enough. It has to also be able to reproduce. So you can think like if you had the fittest individual, which means living better, it just is just really, really, really good at doing stuff, super strong, super attractive, ladies love him, but he is unable to produce any children, then those wonderful, amazing genes that he has, that could potentially become like the major gene for that species by evolution, is not going to matter, because even though he's surviving really well, he's not actually reproducing. So unless you're passing that on, it's not gonna matter so much. Also, the traits have to be heritable, which means you have to be able to inherit them, which means they have to be on genes. It can't be like, there's one major theory this guy named Lamarck came up with that said a giraffe wanted to be able to reach more leaves and have more leaves as an option to eat. So this giraffe with its long neck stretched his neck even longer, to be able to reach the leaves that are at the top of the trees, which is his theory for how we got the super long neck giraffes that we have now. Where that's kind of like saying that, if you get really, 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 really tan, but you're usually really pale, that because you're tan due to sun exposure, you can give that to your children. That doesn't really make any sense. So it has to be like in your genes. You have to be able to inherit it. Now that ability to tan, maybe, but or the ability to stretch its neck, but it has to be in the genes. So it has to be something that you can actually inherit from your parent that benefited your parent, to be able to be considered in this whole natural selection process, because it's over lots and lots and lots of time, and it has to do with reproduction. So it has to be able to be something that can actually be passed on in reproduction. All right, so when we're talking about this, Charles Darwin here is our guy. So he's the one who sort of came up with the theory of natural selection. He worked in the Galapagos Islands, which is a string of islands that are all kind of close together, but they're all distinctly separated by water. So, and relatively far enough apart that if something is, well, it's far enough from mainland that it would have had to be like one individual that got there from the mainland. So what he looked at were finches, which are little birds. So he looked at their beak sizes and actually shapes too. And what he noticed was that there were these finches that had these long, skinny beaks, and there are these finches that have these big, clunky, heavy, big, chunky beaks. And he noticed that there were also lots and lots and lots of different niches being roles or jobs in an environment. There were lots and lots of different niches that these finches were performing. So some of them were responsible for doing things that would require having a long, skinny beak, and some of them were doing things that would require having a big, strong, clunky beak. And also, it had to do with what kind of foods they could eat. So, if you think about it, so what happened was this finch flew out to the islands, and maybe it had some babies there. So maybe it already had some eggs that was ready to lay. And one of its babies had sort of a more narrow beak, and one of them had like a more clunky beak. Well, the sort of narrow beak one, once it grew up, realized it was good at finding food in really, really tiny, tight spaces. And the one with the big clunky beak noticed it was good at eating the really, really big seeds that were around the island. So what happened was they started living in the areas where that food was available. So the one with the long skinny beak had babies that looked like itself, and the longer and the skinnier the beak was, the more it benefited the babies in finding that kind of food. So over time, that section of finches got longer, skinnier beaks. And then the one with the big clunky beak, that's really good at getting big seeds, had babies that had big clunky beaks that are good at crunching big seeds. So that bird would not have been able to get food, the same food that the long skinny beak bird would, because it just wouldn't fit in the places it would need to be able to get the food from. But the little long skinny beak would have no way of crunching those big seeds. So now these two birds are no longer competing with each other. They're not competing with each other for where they're living. They're not competing for what they're eating. So they both continue to thrive. And it's a good thing to have either a longer skinny beak or a big clunky beak. And so now we end up seeing much thousands and millions or whatever of years later, we see one distinct population that has long skinny beaks and one distinct population that has big clunky beaks. And they're doing totally different things, and they're both thriving. And now they're so different because they're not reproducing with each other because they're not in the same place anymore, or eating the same food or associating in any way for really any reason. That now they're two totally different species of finches, but they bear enough similarities to other finches that are on the island. So this is an example showing two different populations where I mean, there's probably hundreds of different ones that were on the island. It's just a simple example of all these different roles in the environment that they could have taken on. And because that role was open, it was able to adapt to that role based on whatever genetics it was just lucky enough to be born with. And I want to make that note that the fact that they were able to adapt to these niches, just like the giraffe stretching its neck. Let's say if it learned, it was able to do something and it learned how to do it, it could not pass that on to its babies. But if it was born with some kind of advantage, such as a long skinny beak or a big clunky beak, then it was able to use that. So it got lucky basically. So they're able to adapt because they got lucky, because they got good genetics from new mutations happening. So what happened in that original mama bird was there was some kind of mutation in the long skinny beak bird that made the beak a little bit longer and skinnier, and then there was some kind of mutation in the big clunky beak bird that made it nice, big, and clunky beak. So mutations that randomly happen, but that allow them to be able to adapt to these new niches. So that happens often in places where there are not organisms that are performing those niches or living in those niches. So like after big extinction events where like lots of those niches like are no longer filled because the animals that were performing them are just totally wiped out. This happens a lot too. So we call this what's called adaptive radiation, adaptive and radiation, because whenever something's like radiant, it's radiating, it's coming out kind of like a sun. Okay, so like a radius to a circle. So adaptive radiation is because all of a sudden there's all of these possibilities and it's just kind of spurting out in all directions. So he also studied the Galapagos tortoises and things like that. That was not the only organism he studied on the islands, but that is the one that was kind of his hallmark example, because there were so many different varieties because of all those niches that were available for them to kind of specialize to. So then he wrote or On the Origin of Species. This is his book. So Origin of Species, meaning they're becoming new species because they're becoming different, because they're not sharing those environments, those niches anymore. And he was a real popular guy for having done that. Okay, so mutations, like we said, those are what cause those new traits or new phenotypes, or phenotypes, physical characteristics. So that long skinny beak was the new phenotype, the big clunky beak was a new phenotype. And it was totally random that happened. It didn't happen just because the mama said, I want some unique babies, let's have some unique babies. Or the baby bird was born and said, it'd be really nice to have a long skinny beak. So that's not what happened. It was totally random that the mutation happened and gave them that gene. And then that adaptive radiation, it adapted and then radiated out, like remember, like the sun, radius coming out from the center of a circle, because of all the possibilities surrounding that original mama bird. Okay, so less competition means that all these open niches, they can just go for it. I mean, there's something open. Hey, look, I sort of am better at doing that than they are. So then they go do that thing, and then that's what they end up doing, and they end up specializing in that. And then you have this whole new species of finch or whatever that's good at doing that job in the environment. So the idea, the main idea here, make sure I didn't miss anything. No, we're good. So natural selection, Charles Darwin's the guy who came up with the official formal idea of it. He wrote it in his book, Origin of Species, meaning a survival and reproduction of the fittest, meaning the fit is the ones that live better. They're not necessarily like beautiful, wonderful, muscle-y things, but they're the ones that are the best at living in that particular environment. So they have to live, and they have to make babies for it to count. Natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. It is what causes evolution to happen, because it's picking and choosing what the best traits are, to keep passing those on and cause that change. And mutations are what cause the new traits to appear to begin with. But it's totally random what they were. Totally random. We learned when we talked about mutations. There is nothing that causes specific mutations. Most mutations probably are either bad or neutral, but sometimes they're good. In this case, if there's a good mutation, it was totally random, but then that helped it live. It didn't happen just because they kind of squeezed really hard and wished and hoped, and then, hey, look, they have a really nice trait. So along those same lines there, it has to be something mutated, some kind of DNA, some kind of gene that can be heritable, because then that reproduction aspect over here makes sense. And then it happens to the population, not the individuals. I did miss that. So the evolution does not happen to an individual. That first little skinny bird, the first little skinny beak bird, evolution did not happen to that. That did not evolve. That adapted to the environment based on its beak shape. So it was able to find its role in the environment based on its beak shape. And then as it reproduced, that population evolved to become the population of skinny beak birds. So evolution is like a group activity. So think of it that way. And then adaptive radiation happened because all those roles in the environment were open. And just remember, adaptive is adapting to the environment, and then radiation is radiating out from the center. All those possibilities open surrounding that little center original bird, that allowed it to then not have any competition and reproduce and eat however it liked. And so it was a really nice, healthy, open, lots of opportunity environment. So main idea, natural selection, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, you should always associate natural selection, Galapagos, finches. Those are the words you should see to go with him. And that natural selection is survival and reproduction, not just survival of the fittest. Please do not make that mistake. And that the traits have to be inherited, and it is totally random whether or not those traits showed up. But if they did show up, then it was a lucky random thing that happened, and hey, look, now I'm good at a new thing, and I can do this adaptive radiation and not have any competition.